All right, so we're going to continue talking about Chapter 7, and we're going to move on to bone development and bone growth. So as a review, we talked a little bit about the functions of bone, a lot about the anatomy of bone, and now we also talked about how bone remodeling occurs and how important it is in calcium regulation. So I want to talk here a little bit about the creation of bone and how bone and cartilage actually grow. Remember, we talked a little bit about the fact that some bones, especially long bones, are going to start forming from a hyaline cartilage model, and this hyaline cartilage model will eventually be replaced by bone. And so we're first going to talk a little bit about hyaline cartilage and the process of cartilage growth, and then we can use that as a jumping off point and start a little bit talking about how bone forms. So cartilage growth is going to begin early in embryonic development. All right, so this is the baby is still, a fetus inside the mother, and it's going to grow in a couple of different ways. So it can grow sort of larger or in length, and so this is going to be called interstitial growth. This generally happens a lot more early in embryonic development. It occurs within the internal regions of the cartilage. So it's like all the cartilage is growing from the inside, and we have a small amount that's eventually getting bigger. And then we also have growth in width, and this means that it's the cartilage is growing along the outer edges, so from any direction. It occurs on the outside edge of the cartilage, and this is going to happen a little bit also in the beginning, but it's going to continue for longer than interstitial growth does. So this right here, we've got a couple of pictures, and if you look up here, this is our hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage in general is going to be covered by what's called a perichondrium. So all of this, let's imagine that we're in the embryo right now, and we have these developing long bones, and we have these little tiny bones that look a little bit like, a humerus or a femur. So they're little tiny little bones, and they don't really look exactly like the adult bones. They're a lot smaller. But they're like the model that the bones will grow on. So they're going to be made of hyaline cartilage, and they're going to be covered in a perichondrium. And remember that all of these tissues, all of the connective tissues are going to start from that embryonic connective tissue, the mesenchyme. But this mesenchyme, in this case, was going to turn into this hyaline cartilage. And so hyaline cartilage is going to have a perichondrium, and this perichondrium is like the outer layer on the outside of the cartilage. It's made of that dense connective tissue. And then on the inside, we have all this hyaline cartilage. And remember that you can't see any of the fibers. It looks kind of clear and glassy. So we've got two different areas. So we can have this part right here is going to be looking at the internal aspects of the cartilage and the very inside. So this is the very beginning of when the cartilage model is starting to grow, and we have rapid growth and expansion of all of this cartilage. And so it's happening on the internal areas, and this is interstitial growth. And next we'll look a little bit here on the outside, and that's going to be the appositional growth. But so we'll start with the very early growth of this hyaline cartilage model and the rapid expansion of it. So first we have this cartilage cell. It is a chondrocyte, right? And so remember, chondrocyte is the word for cartilage cell, and it lives within its little space called a lacunae. And it's going to be stimulated to undergo mitosis again. So we have this chondrocyte, right? It was a mature chondrocyte, it's in its lacunae, but now it's been stimulated to undergo mitosis again. And once it has been stimulated to undergo mitosis, we learned about all the different stages of mitosis, right? Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and it will eventually, right, split at the end. So we have cytokinesis happening here. And it will split into two daughter cells. And so these two daughter cells, will be identical to the original cell, but at this point, we're going to call them, they have kind of gone back to their younger selves, and we're going to call them chondroblast. Remember that blast is going to indicate that these cells are going to be secreting matrix. So these chondroblasts here, right now they're occupying this one lacunae, and they're very cramped together. And they're going to actually start secreting this pink substance here is the new matrix. So this is the new hyaline cartilage matrix, and so each of these chondroblasts is going to start secreting more new hyaline cartilage matrix. And I guess the question is, well, how can it do that? There's not really any room to secrete the matrix here, and that's because at this early stage of cartilage development, the cartilage is still that ground substance is still pretty fluid and it's semi-solid, so it can kind of like push it out of the way. It's not hard and solid like bone, and it's not even as like solidified as like more mature cartilage is later. It's still pretty fluid, and this new ground substance here kind of pushes the old ground substance away. And eventually, each of these little chondrocytes is going to secrete enough ground substance around itself that they'll separate, and then they will each be, they'll have their own lacunae, right? So they're each in their own little little house, right? And once they become separate, right, and they're now in their own little area, then they will continue to secrete more of their ground substance for a little while until, once again, they become these mature chondrocytes. And so this is going to keep happening. As I said, this happens pretty early in, pretty early in embryonic development, when all of this is very sort of fluid-like, and that we have explosive growth happening pretty quickly. This is that interstitial growth here. Next, we have this growth that occurs along the outside. This is going to occur along the outside right here of the perichondrium. So the perichondrium is a lot like the periosteum, and we talked about the fact that the periosteum has its specialized like cellular layer on the inside of the periosteum, and the perichondrium is just like that. So if we think about the periosteum, we said it had osteoclasts and osteoblasts and osteoprogenitor cells, and those osteoprogenitor cells were those unipotent adult stem cells, right? They are going to eventually become bone cells, and we'll talk about this again with bone. But now we have these chondrocytes, and this is going to be early in development, and this perichondrium is going to still have some of these mesenchymal cells in it. And so these are those like sort of chondroprogenitor cells. They're like little stem cells for the cartilage, those chondrocytes. And so it's going to be very much like sort of that inner layer of the periosteum. And these mesenchymal cells here, these little cartilage stem cells, are going to be stimulated to divide. And then they will divide, and one of them will stay as a mesenchymal cell up there, and the other one of the daughter cells, is going to then go down and start dividing and becoming a chondrocyte. Then those chondrocytes can then split here, and it's going to differentiate and become a chondrocyte. So all of these here, these stem cells, are going to start differentiating into these chondrocytes, and these chondrocytes here are then going to secrete matrix around themselves. And so these are all chondroblasts, and so they were undifferentiated stem cells here, then they're going to differentiate and become these chondroblasts, and you can see all of this pink here, this is all new matrix. And so we have a lot of new chondroblasts along the outside here that are secreting more and more new matrix. And so if we follow this one down, we see they're right next to each other, and now they're a little bit bigger, and they're pushing a little bit further away, and now finally they are sort of separate, and there's a little bit of ground substance in between them, and they'll keep pushing apart until they're in their own lacunae. And as you notice, this is the old, more mature cartilage here, and this is the new cartilage, and it's only being laid down along the outside. And that's because this is a little bit denser cartilage here, and now this is going to be happening more as the cartilage becomes more mature. We're going to have more growth along the outsides of the cartilage, because we can't really push a lot. Like once the cartilage gets a little bit more semi-solid, a little more rigid, we can't grow from the interior as much. There's not as much room there, so we have to grow in this appositional growth from along inside the perichondrium. So it's going to grow all the way around the outside of the cartilage. So now that we've briefly talked a little bit about that cartilage formation, we're going to move on to bone formation. And so bone formation is called ossification, or it can be called osteogenesis. So osteo for bone, genesis for like creation. We're creating bone. And this is the formation and development of that bone connective tissue. And as we said, it begins in the embryo. And it's going to continue for a long time through childhood and adolescence. And then once again, we said even once the bones reach their adult length, we're still going to have bone remodeling all the time. It's going to be really important for keeping the bone strong as well as calcium regulation. So by the 8th through 12th weeks of embryonic development, right, so that's pretty early, first trimester, the skeleton is going to begin forming. And there's two different ways that we can have the skeleton form. It can either form from intramembranous ossification or endochondral ossification. And we'll talk about both of these one after the other. So first we'll talk about intramembranous ossification. And this is bone growth from within a membrane, right? So intra, within, membranous is membrane, from within a connective tissue membrane. So that, remember that the initial connective tissue in the bone, or in the body, was from mesenchymal connective tissue. So we're going to start with that embryonic connective tissue, that mesenchymal connective tissue, and then it's going to directly become bone after this. So we're going to have bone growth within that mesenchymal connective tissue membrane. This can also be called dermal ossification, and it produces the flat bones of the skull, some of the facial bones, the mandible, and the central flat part of the clavicle. So it's not as many bones. Endochondral ossification is going to be more important in forming some of the other bones. So intramembranous ossification has a couple of steps, and we'll go through them one by one. And I'll kind of flip back and forth between this and the pictures so you guys can see both of them. So the first thing that happens is that an ossification center is going to form within areas of the mesenchyme. So ossification centers are going to be little areas where bone is happening, right? Ossification or osteogenesis is the formation of bone. So anywhere where we have like an area where a bunch of bone cells come together and we start having bone form, that's going to be called an ossification center. So some of those mesenchymal cells, remember we said those mesenchymal cells are like stem cells, and some of them are going to become osteoprogenitor cells, right? Those are the eventual, adult stem cells. And these osteoprogenitor cells, then some of those are going to become osteoblasts. And osteoblast, remember blast means that it's secreting the matrix. Its job is to secrete osteoid. And osteoid, remember, is the organic portion of the ground substance of bone. So it's going to be full of collagen and things like that. And so it's going to be full of the fibers, collagen, as well as the organic portions of the ground substance. So osteoid is not yet brittle. It doesn't have that calcification that's happened yet in that first step. So here's this first step here. We have our thickened region of the mesenchyme. Some of these mesenchymal cells here are going to become osteoprogenitor cells, which will eventually turn into osteoblasts. These osteoblasts are then going to aggregate together. So they come together and form the center of ossification, and then all of the osteoblasts together are going to start secreting this osteoid, right? So that's going to be that initial sort of semi-solid, soft ground substance of that bone. The next step is that the osteoid is going to undergo calcification, right? And we said calcification is where we have calcium and phosphate deposition. So those calcium salts are deposited onto the osteoid, right around the collagen fibers, and they crystallize into those hydroxyapatite crystals. And that's going to form like the hard, brittle part of the bone. And all of the blasts, right, that had been in the middle here that are then trapped inside their lacunae are going to become osteocytes. They're going to be called osteocytes now. They're mature cells. And so here we have these. This was the first osteoid that was laid down. It was around these two osteoblasts. Then the osteoblasts are going to kind of become trapped there once it becomes calcified, and they're going to mature, and they're going to be sticking their little processes out through these canaliculi and sort of sensing all the different stress that's on the bone, and they're going to be maintaining that matrix. But now we still have these other osteoblasts around the outside, and they're going to continue to secrete more osteoid, and so we'll have this same process kind of repeating itself starting from the middle of this ossification center, and so this is going to be ossification that's spreading out. So each of these will then secrete more osteoid, which will then calcify, and we'll have more and more bone that becomes spread out. So the early or immature type of bone is called woven bone. So this woven bone is kind of not really that well organized. It doesn't have the nice osteons of the compact bone yet, and we can also call it primary bone. And so this is kind of less organized. It's not really the spongy bone or the compact bone yet. It's that immature bone. And so this immature bone is going to be surrounded by some more mesenchyme. And that mesenchyme that's directly surrounding that immature bone is eventually going to form the periosteum. And so we've got this part right here. So these are showing sort of that immature bone being formed, the woven bone here. It has trabeculae like spongy bone does. And on the outside, we have these thickened layers of mesenchyme here, and you can see that we've got some osteoprogenitor cells and osteoblasts forming, starting to form the periosteum. We also have blood vessels coming into the area, right? So blood vessels are important, right? Eventually this will become like the nutrient artery. Our bones are very filled with blood vessels. They're very well vascularized. Now finally we have our lamellar bone that replaces woven bone. So lamellar bone is bone, it's like the compact bone that has the concentric lamella and the interstitial lamella and the internal and external circumferential lamella, and then the spongy bone, remember, has the parallel lamella. So lamellar bone is that more mature bone, the spongy bone on the inside, and the compact bone on the outside that consists of those concentric, or those different layers of bone. And they're going to form from those original trabeculae of that woven bone. And then most of these bones, right, we're forming flat bones like the skull, parts of the facial bones, the cranial bones. And remember that flat bones are going to have those sort of, it's like that sandwich-like appearance. And so we have the two layers of compact bone on the outside, and then we have the spongy bone on the inside, and you've got the periosteum on either side. And so we can see here, this is going to be the periosteum on either side, then we have our compact bone here, and then the spongy bone in the middle. And there's some room for some bone marrow and everything in there with the blood vessels. So this is called intramembranous ossification, and it happens in the embryo, in the flat bone of the skull, and the mandible, some parts of the clavicle. So remember, it doesn't make that many bones, so try to remember some of the bones that are created by intramembranous ossification. And it's formed from a connective tissue membranes, from that mesenchymal connective tissue. So the next part is going to be called endochondral ossification. And endochondral ossification is going to be, begins with the hyaline cartilage model. So that's why earlier we talked a little bit about hyaline cartilage and how hyaline cartilage grows. And this hyaline cartilage model is going to eventually produce most of the bones of the skeleton, including a lot of your long bones, the bones of the upper and lower limbs, the pelvis, the vertebrae, the ends of the clavicle. And so endochondral ossification is going to form a lot of different bones. We're going to kind of give you an example of the humerus. That's the book that, the picture of the bone that is drawn in the book as an example. And so we're going to look at long bone development in the limb, the humerus specifically. And the first thing that's going to happen is that the fetal hyaline cartilage model is going to develop. And this is going to happen pretty early. Once again, we said during the 8th through 12th week of development is when this is going to start happening, once again during that first trimester. So chondroblasts are going to be secreting that cartilage matrix. And let's see, sorry, I'm going to be flipping through. So we've got this right here. This is our hyaline cartilage model. And we have our perichondrium, which is going to be this connective tissue around our hyaline cartilage. And this happens really early, about 8 to 12 weeks. So I'll be flipping through once again. And remember, at this point, we have both, at this very early parts right here, during 8th through 12th weeks of development, we're going to have both the appositional and interstitial cartilage growth happening. So remember, interstitial cartilage growth is going to happen first, and it's going to happen when we have that explosive amount of cartilage growth. And then after that, as it gets, once like we have the model formed a little bit more and we're just getting it bigger, we're going to have more, mostly appositional growth happening along the inside edges of the perichondrium. So the next step here is that the cartilage is going to calcify, and a periosteal bone collar is going to form. And cartilage is not normally supposed to calcify, so it's not really that healthy for cartilage. The ground substance is normally the semi-solid, and it doesn't usually calcify. And so those chondrocytes in the cartilage model are going to produce some holes in the matrix, so they're going to expand, the lacunae get a little bit bigger. The matrix is going to calcify, so we have some calcium deposition here, where that usually doesn't happen. And the chondrocytes are kind of trapped in there, and they're going to die. this produces a calcified cartilage shaft with large holes in it. So it seems kind of bad at first, but it's normal and healthy part of development that will eventually be covered up by bone. Blood vessels are going to start growing towards the cartilage. Remember, the blood vessels are going to be really important. Our bone is well vascularized, but cartilage isn't. So the cartilage originally was avascular, but now we're having blood vessels are growing towards the cartilage. And the blood vessels are going to bring in some needed nutrients and growth factors. And we also have some of these osteoprogenitor cells here, osteoblasts and osteoclasts are going to come in. And the osteoblasts are going to develop, right? They'll develop into those osteoblasts that secrete the osteoid. And they're going to form a layer of osteoid around the calcified cartilage shaft. And so on the outside, we're going to have a layer of osteoid on the outside. And that's going to form what's called a periosteal bone collar. So peri is around, osteum is like around the bone, and then it's forming like a collar that goes around. And so this part right here we can see is going to be 2. So we started with this nice model. Now we have these lacunae are getting bigger. The matrix of the cartilage is calcifying and the chondrocytes themselves are dying. So we're going to have this like very brittle center of this with dead chondrocytes, lots of holes in it. And this little artery here is going to be bringing in some growth factors and osteocytes. And osteoblast, and around the outside here we're going to have these osteoblasts coming around the outside, and they're going to begin laying down a layer of bone around this calcified cartilage shaft, and this will eventually become the diaphysis of the long bone. Now we'll go to the third part here. This is all happening during the fetal period, right? So during gestation. As the fetus gets a little bit older here, you can see this is the humerus over here, and this is pretty cool too. This this is a special stain to show all the dark areas here in this picture are going to be the cartilage model. So this is like the hyaline cartilage model that will eventually become replaced by bone. This later is going to be the developing long bones. This is the diaphysis here, and then we can't see the epiphysis yet because the epiphysis is not yet turned into bone. So only the diaphysis has started. So now let's move on to 3. And step 3 here is going to be when our primary ossification center is going to form in the diaphysis. Remember, we said that an ossification center is an area where we have a bunch of osteocytes, osteoblasts coming together and where the bone starts ossifying. Now, we already said we had this nutrient artery, this artery coming in towards the bone, and it was bringing growth factors and bringing some blood cells. We can call it a periosteal bud. So this periosteal bud is going to extend from the periosteum into the cartilage shaft, and it's going to grow. Those capillaries are going to grow in. It's going to bring some osteoblasts in. Osteoblasts are going to produce osteoid on the calcified cartilage template. So it's kind of like a template that the osteoid can be laid down on. This is going to cause the primary ossification center. The primary ossification center is found in the diaphysis, the shaft of the long bone. This is the first major center of bone formation, and this is going to be like each bone is going to have its own primary ossification center, and they're all going to form sometime, between that 8th and 12th week. Most of them are formed by around the 12th week of development, so in that first trimester. The bone is going to develop. It's going to start at the center, and then it's going to extend in both directions towards the epiphysis of the long bone. So make sure that you review the terms and the anatomy of the long bone from lab last week. The bone connective tissue is then going to displace that calcified degenerating cartilage, and so we're going to have a nice layer of bone here in the diaphysis. So here we can see that our blood vessel has grown in, right? So our nutrient artery is coming in to feed nutrients into our shaft, and we're having osteocytes or osteoblasts coming in and secreting osteoid, and we're having some ossification happening in the center here. It's taking over that calcified cartilage matrix. The other thing that's happening here is we have some more blood vessels that are going to be going into the epiphysis. So we've got some more blood vessels that are entering here into the epiphysis of this long bone. So next, this is going to be kind of later on during development as into the newborn areas. We're going to have our development of our secondary centers of ossification. So primary center of ossification is in the diaphysis, whereas our secondary centers that we'll talk about soon are going to be in the epiphysis of the long bones. And so step 4 is going to be when our secondary ossification center forms in the epiphysis. So once again, the hyaline cartilage is going to calcify and degenerate in the epiphysis areas, just like it did in the diaphysis. Those blood vessels that were growing in step 3 continue to grow in. They bring those osteoprogenitor cells and they bring some osteoblasts, and we're going to start laying down some more osteoid on top of that calcified cartilage model. And so that's going to be the secondary ossification centers that are forming, usually in the epiphysis. And so the bone will then displace the cartilage, and so we'll have the shaft of the bone, the diaphysis, will then be consisting of that bone connective tissue, and then we'll have another area on top. The epiphysis is going to have some bone connective tissue forming there. Now, not all of these are formed at the time of birth, so they're forming later throughout the fetal period, and then a lot of them, or some of them, will be formed at birth, but some of them will be formed after birth also. And so this bone development is continuing as the newborn continues to grow. And you can imagine how tiny they are when they're born, and they get so big so quickly. The other thing that's happening here is that the osteoclasts are going to be really active. They're resorbing some of the bone matrix, especially along that inner edge, to create the hollow medullary cavity. And so what resides in the medullary cavity? Do you guys remember, what does the medullary cavity contain in an infant especially? It contains bone marrow, and in an infant and a child, it's actually going to be red bone marrow, right? That's going to be doing the important job of hemopoiesis, or creating blood cells. And so this is going to be pretty important. So here we have our secondary ossification centers forming up here. And these secondary ossification centers are going to eventually replace all this cartilage in the epiphysis, except for this on the edge over here. On the edges of these synovial joints, we'll have some articular cartilage left. And then if we look here at this primary ossification center, you can see how the bone is starting to look more like the long bones that we labeled, and the osteoclasts are working to produce this marrow cavity so that we can have some red bone marrow filling that. Then we'll be moving on to what happens as a child and later in our teen to adult years. And so step 5 is going to be when these secondary ossification centers are maturing, right? And as I said before, the epiphysis will be completely replaced. The cartilage in the epiphysis will be almost completely replaced by bone connective tissue, except for the articular cartilage at the top. And so now we have one primary, like in this case for the humerus, one primary ossification center, and then we have 2 secondary ossification centers, one in the proximal epiphysis and one in the distal epiphysis. But if you look here, they are not connected. So they're separated by this epiphyseal plate. And this epiphyseal plate is still made up of that hyaline cartilage that was originally there from the cartilage model. And this is also called the growth plate. That's kind of like the common term for it. And this is where the bone is going to be growing in length. So we'll talk a little bit about bone growth in length as well as width, and then some of the hormones that are going to be important in this. And then eventually, as the bones grow, we start out with thick growth plates, and they're eventually going to narrow and narrow and narrow as you get towards adulthood. And then finally, the epiphyseal plates are going to close and ossify, and they'll form the epiphyseal lines. And so this will happen until about puberty. So bone is going to get longer and longer and longer into puberty. At puberty, it's going to have really long growth spurts. They'll get longer, but the growth plates also narrow. And then eventually, once the growth plates close, that means the bone has reached its adult length. And then depending on the bone, it can occur anywhere between the ages of 10 and 25. And each bone is going to have a different age that it usually closes. And so this is going to be, a child's bone where we have an adult bone here. As you can see, it has the marrow cavity, the medullary cavity is a little bit bigger. And that bone marrow that was during your, infant years, it was red bone marrow. And in the child years, it was more red bone marrow. In the adult, it's going to be replaced by yellow bone marrow. And then this here, epiphyseal plate, as it eventually closes, is going to be replaced by the epiphyseal line. So we can see that sort of thick, sort of more compact bone in the middle of the spongy bone here, and that's the epiphyseal line. So now I want to talk a little bit about how the bone grows in length. And so we're going to be looking here, and it's going to be during childhood that this bone is going to be growing a lot. And so here's the epiphyseal plate, and this is where the bone is going to grow in length. Now obviously it also needs to grow in width because it doesn't just stay like a tiny little newborn bone, it gets bigger. But we're going to talk first about how it grows in length, and it's going to be growing from here, right? Obviously it's going to be, it would be hard if the whole thing was bone. We would have to sort of, it could only grow from the outside, and the outsides, you know, are covered in articular cartilage. It's not really a good place for it to grow, and that would be hard for the joints. So it's good that it's not, the whole thing is not going to be bone. And so the growth is going to be happening here, and it's going to be kind of pushing the epiphysis away from the diaphysis. So it's going to push the distal and proximal epiphysis away from the center of the diaphysis, and it's going to be making the bone longer as it goes. And so if we take a look at the epiphyseal plate, if we look at it under a microscope, we can identify 5 different zones in the epiphyseal plate. And I don't know why this keeps starting with 2. This should be 1, just like the last one. The first one is the zone of resting cartilage. And this is the zone that's nearest the epiphysis. So on the proximal epiphysis, it's going to be, you know, more proximal. In the distal epiphysis, it's more distal. It's nearer to the epiphysis. And in this case, it looks a lot like normal resting hyaline cartilage. There are small chondrocytes. They're distributed throughout the matrix. It doesn't look very active. It's pretty normal, and it secures the epiphysis to the epiphyseal plate. And I'm going to show you some pictures. So this is that first zone here of resting cartilage, and that's going to be connecting up to the epiphysis. So up here would be the epiphysis, and then the diaphysis would be down here near zone 5. And this is not very active part of the epiphyseal plate. As we move down to zone 2, we call this the zone of proliferating cartilage. And during this part, you can look, and it almost looks like you have little like stacks of coins. And so these stacks of coins here are going to be proliferating chondrocytes. So during zone 2, these chondrocytes are stimulated to rapidly undergo mitosis. And they undergo mitosis pretty quickly, so they actually don't get that much bigger here. They just kind of they divide so quickly that they're pretty small and thin, and it looks like we have like a big line of cells or a line of coins that are laying one on top of each other. And so they align in this longitudinal columns of the flattened lacunae. And these columns are parallel to the long axis of the diaphysis. And so we can see here that these are the lines of those flattened lacunae, and we have chondrocytes within them because they're quickly dividing. As we move down to zone 3, so the zone 3 over here is the zone of hypertrophic cartilage. And this zone of hypertrophic cartilage is after they have stopped dividing and now they're hypertrophying. So they're getting bigger. And so each cell itself is getting bigger. And so the walls of the lacunae between them start to thin. And just like this kind of happened at the beginning with that calcified cartilage shaft, in the beginning of our endochondral ossification, they got bigger, and then eventually the cartilage calcified and then the chondrocytes died off. And that's kind of the same thing that will happen here. So the 4th zone is going to be the zone of calcified cartilage. And this is going to be about 2 to 3 layers of chondrocytes. And here, minerals, once again, will be deposited on this between the columns of lacunae. And these minerals, you know, normally the cartilage is not supposed to be calcified. It doesn't have calcium in it. It's not calcified like that, so it's not healthy for the chondrocytes, and so they're going to die off. So that zone of calcified cartilage is going to be a lot like that calcified cartilage shaft that we talked about in the endochondral ossification. So here is this zone of calcified cartilage where we have these large sort of areas. We had the big lacunae where they were filled with chondrocytes. The chondrocytes have kind of died off now, and we're left with this calcified cartilage template. So very similar to what happened in the beginning of endochondral ossification. Now finally, zone 5, it's going to be this purple looking zone down here, and this is the zone of ossification. So this is where everything here was all cartilage, right? So So the growth is actually happening, the cartilage itself is actually growing. The bone isn't growing itself, the cartilage is growing, and then that cartilage, it grows and then dies off and is replaced by bone down here by the diaphysis. And this is that zone of ossification. And so the walls break down between those lacunae and columns. We have capillaries that are going to rush in, because remember, the cartilage was avascular. There were no capillaries before. The capillaries are going to rush in, and they bring in those osteoprogenitor cells, which turn into osteoblasts, and the osteoblasts are going to secrete that osteoid, and then that osteoid is deposited on that calcified cartilage matrix, and eventually this whole area gets turned to bone. And so here, the biggest growth is going to happen in zones 2 and 3, the zones of proliferating cartilage as the chondrocytes divide, and the zones of hypertrophic cartilage as each of those chondrocytes gets bigger. And so we're having actually a lot of the length is happening in zones 2 and 3. So the cartilage itself is actually growing, but then eventually that cartilage is then replaced by bone in zone 5. And this pushes the zone of resting cartilage towards the epiphysis, and it's going to lengthen the bone in both directions. So this is important. The epiphyseal plates are going to maintain their width and their thickness all throughout childhood. So they're going to stay just about as thick as they were all throughout childhood. We're going to have the same rate, just as fast as the cartilage is made, that same amount of cartilage is then ossified. All right, so if we make an inch of new cartilage every month, you know, that an inch of that is ossified, and so on. So if it grows, the cartilage, you know, grew an inch longer, an inch of that is ossified. The cartilage grows an inch longer, an inch of that is ossified, and so on. And so during childhood, this still maintains the same thickness. And so just as much as the cartilage grows, whatever cartilage has grown, we're ossifying the same amount. And so it's going to have the same thickness during childhood. At maturity, though, the rate of cartilage production is going to slow, whereas the rate of ossification is going to stay the same. So eventually we're going to be ossifying more cartilage than is made. And so as this happens, as we're ossifying more cartilage, let's say we only make half an inch of cartilage during that month, but we ossify an inch of it, and it's obviously not really that much. I'm just kind of making up some numbers here. So each time that happens, we're going to narrow the growth plate. So as you reach maturity, and we'll talk about some of the hormones that are involved in this, the rate of ossification is going to speed up faster than the rate of cartilage growth. And so it's going to start creeping, this zone of ossification is going to start creeping closer and closer and closer to the epiphysis. Right? So we're going to ossify a little bit more every time. And so eventually, once it gets all the way and all of that cartilage is turned to bone, and once that happens, then we say the growth plates have closed. And that becomes the epiphyseal line, and that's when the bone has reached its adult length and we cannot grow anymore. And we can see here, this is a radiograph or an x-ray of a child's hand, and you can see here, right, so we've got the radius and we have the ulna, and this is going to be the diaphysis here, and the epiphysis is up here. So this is the little epiphysis, and we can see this line in between them, and this is where the growth plate is, the epiphyseal line. On these radiographs or x-rays, bone shows up really well, but cartilage is not as hard as bone, right? It does not show up as well, so a lot of times cartilage is going to look clear, and that's why this cartilage kind of looks clear on these radiographs, because it's going to be the hyaline cartilage that makes up those growth plates. So really quickly, forensic anthropology, it's probably been popularized by that TV show Bones, and basically this is going to be where we're looking at skeletons. We're trying to figure out details of, you know, who the person was before they died. We can kind of look at the growth plates to help age the skeleton. You can do this with the skull also. We'll talk a little bit about this. If the growth plate is open, that means there's no union at all between the epiphysis and the other bone end. That's going to be, you know, a younger individual. Partial union means there's some fusion between the epiphysis and the rest of the bone, so that means it's partially starting to close. It's a little bit older individual. And complete union is that all visible aspects are united to the rest of the bone. And that's going to be the bone has reached the adult length. Female epiphyseal plates usually fuse about 1 to 2 years earlier than males, and they've got charts of like when exactly each bone is supposed to, normally the average time that the growth plates will close in males versus females. So as I said before, our bones are going to get longer, but they also get wider, right? Because obviously a tiny little baby is going to have a very, really thin humerus, but it gets a lot wider as you grow. And so we can't just make them longer. We also have to increase the width. And this is going to happen via appositional bone growth. So just like the appositional bone growth we talked about in cartilage, this is going to occur along the edges of the periosteum. So in cartilage, we said appositional cartilage growth occurred along the inside edges of the perichondrium. Here we have our appositional bone growth happening along the internal edges of the periosteum. So once again, remember that the periosteum is lined by an intercellular layer of osteoprogenitor cells and osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And so these osteoprogenitor cells can, divide and become osteoblasts, and those osteoblasts can lay down concentric layers of bone along the outside of your bone to make it wider and wider and wider. And so the outside layers are all going to be new layers of bone. And so the bone is going to start thin, and it's going to get wider and wider and wider as we get more and more bone laid down. Just on the inside of the periosteum. At the same time as this happens, our medullary cavity, as we saw in our pictures, it started out a little bit smaller, but it gets wider and wider as you get towards adulthood. So we have some osteoclast activity, and this is going to be in lining the medullary cavity. And remember, that's lined by something called the endosteum, and the endosteum has also got those osteoblasts and osteoclasts and osteoprogenitor cells. On the endosteum, though, the osteoclast will be a little bit more active, and we're going to be resorbing some of that bone. And so as we can see, we have this small little infant bone, gets larger and larger and wider, and eventually becomes this adult bone, and with a larger medullary cavity. All right. So I wanted to mention more about bone remodeling, or a little bit more about it. We mentioned a little bit in our last lecture on calcium regulation that our bones are remodeling all the time. So even once your bone is going to reach, adult length and adult width, that doesn't mean it stops. It's not going to be metabolically, stable at that point. It's still going to undergo remodeling all the time. This continues throughout adulthood. And it occurs both at the periosteal and endosteal surfaces of the bone. So just like here, the periosteum is on the outside and the endosteum is on the inside. So we have most of the remodeling happening right here along these surfaces that have those cellular layers with the osteoclast and the osteoblast and the osteoprogenitor cells. It can occur at different rates in different parts of the bone. So for example, the distal part of the femur, like the distal epiphysis, is replaced every 4 to 6 months, so that's pretty impressive, whereas the diaphysis of the femur is not completely replaced over a lifetime. So we have different rates of bone remodeling depending on where in the skeleton and how much stress that area is put under. But about 20% of the skeleton is replaced yearly, which is actually a lot if you think about it. And this is going to be dependent upon our osteoclasts and our osteoblasts. We want to make sure that they're staying relatively stable. We don't want to have too much bone growth and not enough resorption, or too much resorption and not enough growth. The osteocytes are important in maintaining the matrix, and they're also important in sensing how much stress is put on the bone, and therefore telling the bone, if it needs to get stronger. And this is influenced both by hormones and that mechanical stress that we talked about. So mechanical stress is actually really important. And mechanical stress is any sort of weight-bearing activity. So where you're walking around, doing some sort of activity, you're putting some stress on those bones. And your osteocytes, with their little processes that stick out through those canaliculi, are going to be able to feel that stress. You might even have little microfractures in the bone if you're doing some sort of training and you're doing a little bit more high-intensity exercise. This mechanical stress is good and important because it's required for normal bone remodeling. Those osteocytes are going to detect that stress, and they communicate to the osteoblasts and tell them, hey, this bone is undergoing stress. It needs to get stronger. And that's going to tell the osteoclast to increase the synthesis of osteoid. So it's going to make more and denser bone. This increases bone mass. So weight-bearing activities help you increase bone mass. This is why, astronauts that go up into zero gravity, they don't have this weight-bearing activity anymore. And so they can actually lose a lot of bone mass because their osteocytes don't stimulate the osteoblasts, and they don't synthesize that osteoid. If we don't have mechanical stress, so either if you're an astronaut and go up into space with, zero gravity or less gravity, which is not as likely, or maybe if you have an injury, right, and your leg is in a cast and you're not walking for a while, or you're in a wheelchair, that's going to decrease your stress. Or if you're bedridden, you have some sort of, you have some sort of virus or something and you're in the bed for a long time. This can remove mechanical stress, and that can decrease bone mass. And usually you can come back down and, once you get active again, you can try to regain that bone mass. But it's easier if you're younger. Hormones are also going to be influencing this. And so now we mentioned a little bit about hormones already when we talked about parathyroid hormone and we talked about calcitriol in our last chapter. The last part of this chapter. But I want to kind of introduce what a hormone is. Now, we will talk a lot about hormones in Chapter 17. And Chapter 17 is part of 169, so not this class, but next class. But hormones are pretty important. Hormones are little molecules, little tiny molecules. I think of them, chemical messengers. They're released from one cell or gland into the blood. They travel through the blood to an effector. So they're going to affect different body cells. They only affect certain cells, right? So they're not going to affect every cell necessarily. They only affect cells that have a specific receptor for that specific hormone. Each receptor is specific to its own type of hormone. So maybe your thyroid hormone, right, is going to send out cells, and they're going to go to whatever cells in your body have receptors for that thyroid hormone. It's going to bind to that cell and cause changes in that cell. So it can be lots of different types of changes, like maybe insulin's going to tell your body cells to take glucose out of the blood to use it. Some of these specifically, since we're talking about the bone, some of them might alter the rates of chondrocyte, osteoblast, or osteoclast activity. And that is eventually going to affect the bone composition and growth patterns. So we're going to talk generally about a couple of different hormones that affect this. So these, we'll talk first about hormones that are important in growth, like during childhood, during the growth phase. Now, the easiest one to remember is that growth hormone. Growth hormone, also called somatotropin, is going to be very important because it helps you grow, right? So it makes your bones grow. This is important in childhood, and adolescence. So we're going to have bones and muscles especially are going to be growing. We'll talk a lot more about it in Chapter 17. It's produced by the anterior pituitary gland, which is a gland up here in your brain, sits at the base of your brain. It stimulates the liver to produce a hormone called insulin-like growth factor, or somatomedin. And then they work together to stimulate the growth of cartilage in the epiphyseal plate. Remember, we said that those zones in 2 and 3, the zones of proliferating cartilage and the zones of hypertrophic cartilage, that's where the growth happens, right? And then so the cartilage grows, and then eventually it ossifies. And so growth hormone is going to help increase those chondrocytes, increase the mitosis in those chondrocytes in the cartilage of the epiphyseal plates. So they're going to be growing longer. Thyroid hormone is another hormone that's important. Thyroid hormone is secreted by the thyroid gland, which is this butterfly-shaped gland up here in your throat. And basically, it's going to influence your metabolic rate. It influences the metabolic rate of lots of cells, but since we're talking about the skeletal system, it influences the metabolic rate of bone cells, and it increases their activity. And so it's going to help regulate the normal activity of the epiphyseal plate. So both growth hormone and thyroid hormone are important, and they're active during the growing phases, like childhood and adolescence, or childhood especially. We'll talk about adolescence in just a second. Now, sex hormones are going to be most active in adolescence. So obviously, growth hormone and thyroid hormones still are, but they are also active in childhood. Once you get to adolescence, we're adding some more hormones into the mix. So the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone, are going to be really important, and they're going to start being produced in great amounts during puberty. This is going to be important because it dramatically accelerates bone growth. So think about the growth spurts that kids hit when they get to puberty. It's going to increase both the rate of cartilage growth and the rate of bone formation in the epiphyseal plate. But here's the thing, as I said before, eventually the bone formation is going to overtake the cartilage growth. So both of them will increase, but the bone formation increases more. And so eventually we have these big growth spurts, but as we have more and more bone formation, and the bone formation is happening a little bit faster than cartilage formation, we're going to be narrowing those growth plates until the growth plates eventually close. And so the sex hormones are going to do two things. So first, they kickstart those growth spurts, but those growth spurts are going to end when, because we have the bone formation rate is greater than the cartilage growth, the growth plates are going to narrow as they grow. So those growth spurts are good. They're increasing the length of the long bone, but they're also going to be precipitating the eventual closing of the growth spurts. Or closing of the growth plates, excuse me. So there's two more hormones that we'll talk about. I'm just briefly going to mention them. I probably won't ask too much about them on the exam. But glucocorticoids is the first one. And these are a group of steroid hormones. And so gluco means glucose, so they're important in regulating the amount of glucose in the blood. They're also associated with stress in the immune system. They're released from the adrenal gland, the outer layers, and we'll learn more about them later, but high amounts have been thought to and shown to increase bone loss. And so there are some research that shows it impairs growth at the epiphyseal plate in children. This is pretty much important because we can use glucocorticoids clinically in cases of asthma and things like that to help suppress the immune system and to decrease inflammation. And so if a child is receiving high doses of glucocorticoids, then you just want to make sure to monitor their bone growth and make sure that it's not affecting the bone growth. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter and a hormone, so we'll talk a lot about neurotransmitters in a bit. But your bones actually have receptors for serotonin, and so it has a not very well defined role in the regulation of normal bone remodeling. But we think that if levels are too high, then the osteoprogenitor cells can't turn into osteoblast, and it might be linked to low bone density disorders, but they're still doing research in this area. All right, so that is the last thing I have for you about hormones and bone growth. It was a lot, I know. It's a little bit overwhelming, so if you need to watch it again, feel free. I will also give you a link to an Edpuzzle that you guys can do to kind of help with it.